Right, hello and good evening, everybody, and good day to the US. I'm speaking again to Dave Decamp from antiwar.com. Yeah, Dave, welcome back.
Hey, Hugo, thanks for having me back. Good to talk to you.
Right, so the reason I got you on is you're obviously in the US, you guys just had an election. US elections are highly consequential for the rest of the world for obvious reasons, especially when it comes to foreign policy. The US president supposedly sets a lot of foreign policy, although we know in practice that's not that true. There's think tanks and things happening. But what is your sense of this vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Israel, Palestine, and I suppose other conflicts that's going on?
Well, right now, this is the transition period now. So Trump won the election. He's filling out his cabinet, and then he gets inaugurated on January 20th. So I think this is a really dangerous time right when it comes to the conflict in the Middle East because Israel, especially Netanyahu, they do things, they time certain things that they do with, the political situation in the U.S. and the transition period. Right now, the Biden administration has kind of pretended like they care about, the civilian casualties and the starvation blockade on Gaza, even though they haven't actually taken any action. Um, so I could see Israel kind of really ramping things up, which they already have in Gaza. I mean, they're openly carrying out this ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza right now. And I think they're going to try to do that as rapidly as they can over these next 2 months before Trump comes in. Because even if at this point, maybe now, if Biden decides to cut off the Israelis from military aid, it's really going to be too late. Um, and, Trump will be able to come in and just reverse everything. So I think Netanyahu's going to try to really push his luck with Biden when it comes to Gaza. So the violence could get even worse there, even though it's so bad right now. And then when it comes to Iran, there's these reports that Israel's thinking about bombing their nuclear facilities, which realistically Israel would need help from the US to do that, to get the facilities that are deep underground. But I think the idea that they're even talking about that is concerning because again, with this transition period, this is something during the last transition period 4 years ago when Biden was elected, Israel assassinated an Iranian scientist. They really ramped up their strikes on Iran. It seemed like they were trying to get something going then. So now, especially, I could see them wanting to get another kind of cycle of escalation with Iran in this time period, because if Israel really comes under if Israel comes under an Iranian attack again, the U.S. is going to defend them. And if things really escalate, it could really turn into full blown war. And I think it's clear that Netanyahu doesn't want war with Iran by himself. He wants the U.S. to be involved. And he knows that if Israel really starts taking some hits from Iran, um, then the U.S. is going to get involved. So I think there's definitely the risk of that happening right now.
So my impression has always been, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that the US has been a little bit more reluctant when it came to a war with Iran. A few reasons for it. One being that Iran can easily send missiles into the Saudi Arabian oil fields and sink a part of the world economy. We've now also seen this year that Iran can attack Israel directly, and the Iron Dome has been, as many suspected, a scam since the beginning. So the Iranians just proved what most experts suspected of the thing. And so I guess the question is, what is the U.S. attitude to that? I mean, even under the Trump administration, because Trump, from my understanding, has a few anti-war candidates with him, but the majority of the positions he's currently chosen seems to be like neocon extremists, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, Trump was very hawkish on Iran, killing Soleimani, the maximum pressure campaign that they called it. But it does seem like he doesn't want, full blown war with Iran. I don't think many people in the U.S. really want that, except for some of the worst neocons and hawks. I don't think it's confirmed yet, but the all the reports are saying that Trump's going to make Marco Rubio his Secretary of State. He's a senator from Florida, and he's about as hawkish as you can get. So that is concerning with him. And we have seen some rhetoric from Trump, like with Iran, that makes it sound like he might take a really hard line against them. Another one, Brian Hook, who is an official in the previous Trump administration who basically led the Iran policy of, pulling out of the nuclear deal, sanctions, and the assassination of Soleimani. And he's in charge of the new state, the transition team for the new State Department. So that's not a good sign. And it does seem like, again, I think overall the U.S. doesn't want a direct conflict with Iran, but they're going to support Israel to the hilt. And that's another thing with all the people that he's putting in place, even the ones that aren't as hawkish, they're all still very pro-Israel, extremely pro-Israel. He, so, if they're going to back Israel the way Biden has, Israel's going to keep doing things, escalating, especially if Netanyahu really wants to take it to Iran. He's going to see this as his opportunity. So, and what would a war between the U.S. and Iran really look like? I mean, the U.S. would probably just, I wouldn't imagine any sort of ground fighting, or anything like that. I would just imagine really heavy U.S. airstrikes, Iran firing its missiles at, like you mentioned, the Saudi oil fields, U.S. bases in the Middle East. And some of those bases are really exposed. If Iran really wanted to hit them, they could kill some Americans,
Well, the way Iran's defenses have been structured, and I've been to Bushehr where I've seen this myself, is essentially they've got a suicide button.
Yeah.
So if ever they're going to be attacked, they're just going to blow rockets into, as you say, strategic assets, and I suspect Tel Aviv as well. As far as we know, Iran does not yet have a nuclear weapon. The IAEA confirms it. I'm convinced Gareth Porter's book is correct on this. And even the CIA director, was a speech he gave recently, and he sort of hinted, he said the Iranian government has not resumed their program since 2003. And nobody sort of understood what the implications, what he said, is which the CIA actually admits they don't have a nuclear weapons program. This was a few months ago. So I'm not convinced they have that, but they can assemble it, I suspect, if they want to. Okay, and put that, imagine that on a ballistic missile. So it's a suicide button, which will be insane. And then the other thing that I think is underappreciated is that Iran has got a conscript army, where the conscripts serve very close to home. So if ever they're going to be invaded and occupied, it's going to be a bloodbath because the soldiers have local intelligence and they'll know who to attack. It'll be like the Iraq insurgencies. So I guess still the US has that thing. The other point I'd like to make here is on the anti-war candidates that surround them. Supposedly J.D. Vance, who said he doesn't want a war with Iran, made some statement recently, right? And Elon Musk, who says good things about Ukraine, but he's never said anything against Israel. He's even taken photo ops with Netanyahu. I mean, what I suppose what makes them anti-war and yet pro-Israel at the same time?
Well, that's a good question. That is one problem because we've had Trump and kind of, the MAGA Republicans around him say they want to end endless wars in the Middle East and everything, but they are all pro-Israel. And as long as you want to keep supporting Israel the way that the U.S. does, the U.S. isn't going to get out of the Middle East. They're against, I know some of them want to withdraw from Syria, withdraw from Iraq. But at the same time, when Trump tried to pull out of Syria the last time he was president, when he made the decision to stay, everybody remembered he said, "Oh, we're going to secure the oil." That was one of the reasons he gave. He said, "We're going to stay there, secure the oil." But another reason he gave was that because Israel wants us there, and Israel definitely wants the U.S. to keep that presence. So it really gets in the way. And I do think Vance is much better than other options Trump could have went with for vice president. Very good on Ukraine. He's a China hawk. They're all China hawks. That's the thing. China is a whole nother thing. Right. Right now we're more worried about the situation in the Middle East and Ukraine, but China's kind of the future conflict that's brewing. And even all the good people that Trump could pick are all basically China hawks. A lot of the argument is disengage from the Middle East, wind down support for Ukraine so we could focus on China. But I mean, it's still just very enmeshed in the American Republican parties, this support for Israel, this kind of fervent support, don't even question it. That's basically what all the Republicans that ran for re-election this time around were running as. They're the pro-Israel party, and, they're more supportive of Israel than the Democrats. So it's still just very ingrained. For some of them, it is religious. There's these evangelical Christians who believe in this theology that they, the Jews need to be in Israel, rebuild the third temple to bring about the end times. You know, Mike Huckabee, this is who Trump just appointed as the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He's a former governor in the U.S., but he is, very stridently believes this about Israel, that God gave the modern state of Israel this land. And he's gone over, he's very close with settlers. He said things like, there's no such thing as an occupation. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. It's another thing he said. So this is who Trump appoints to be the ambassador to Israel. So, that's not a good sign. It does show that even though there's kind of more anti-war sentiment right now among Republicans than there has been in a while, but this Israel thing is still not going away. And if that's there, then the U.S. is not getting out of the Middle East.
Right. And I mean, all this talk then, I guess, I mean, you sort of hear it mostly in the more left-wing media of Iran wanting to re-engage with the US, signs of negotiations, things like that. Within the Iranian media, it's a bit different. I don't think they're that naive, to be honest. But, there's talk of this. I mean, this stuff will just not happen then, I suppose, under the Trump administration.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen Pezeshkian, the president, say that, just say the other day, that they want to deal with they're going to need to deal with the U.S. And he came in really saying, and the Ayatollah kind of gave him the green light. It seemed like when he was inaugurated, he said something like, if you must, I forget exactly how he put it, but he said something like, if you must, talk to the enemy.
Yeah, because you see, the Iranian president does not set foreign policy. It's not like the US. It's the Guardian Council that does it. So he has to get a green light from above to set so. But of course, the Iranians have always had, and this is not a good thing on their behalf, had a policy that's ambiguous as well. They would say re-engage with the US as a sign to show it, and at the same time to sort of calm the hardliners at home, which is also a problem in Iran. They would, say the opposite. So it's a very, very strategic, ambiguous, type of terms that they use all the time. And of course, in the US, unfortunately, US policymakers have never understood ambiguity. They just, assume the worst all of the time. And basically want to escalate on the war footing.
Yeah. And that's another thing about the Republican Party is that they are all Iran hawks, like every single one of them, basically. And again, that doesn't mean that they want a direct war with Iran. And you mentioned like the idea of an invasion. Like, I don't think that's anything even close to being on the table. And the idea of what I imagine if it's war between the US and Iran, it's just an exchange of missile and airstrikes until, at some point they decide, all right, we got to figure out how to end this. Because the U.S. is not invading Iran. I mean, the only place there is a chance of them, ground battles happening in Iraq or something, but I just can't see any sort of invasion. But
I just think it'll be costly if somebody's that foolish. I don't say it's beyond the US to do this because some of these neocons tend to be incompetent as well, so they can easily tripwire into a war.
Yeah,
but I just think they underestimate. It's not going to be Iraq. It's a bit of a different type of fight that they're gonna prepare themselves for.
The thing is, there's no appetite in the U.S., even though a lot of people might buy the propaganda about Iran, but the force that they would need for a full invasion and everything, I just can't imagine them getting enough people to sign up for that. But when you look at the Republicans, I mean, the Republicans in Congress, when they talk about Iran, it's just completely hysterical. Just any kind of sense, common sense is just completely out the window. You see the things they say about Biden, like, oh, he gave Iran $6 billion and then Hamas attacked Israel. Like, they connect everything that happens in the Middle East to Iran. Even though Biden, they say that they're going to bring back this maximum pressure campaign. That's what Trump's national security advisor said. And that again, that refers to the sanctions and everything. And Biden has really continued that essentially. I think the problem for him is that Iran has found places to sell their oil in Asia where they're not afraid of U.S. sanctions. You see these Republicans say, oh, we got to enforce the sanctions harder to cut off those oil sales. But I think those companies just don't care, just aren't worried about.
Also, I mean, they sort of treat Iran like they were treating Russia until this war started. I mean, it was John McCain who said, "What Russia is a gas station with what is it, some phrase like that?"
Gas station with nukes, yeah.
with nukes, basically. They sort of see Iran in the same breath, where I keep on, reminding people Iran's oil is actually declining. It's been so for years. It's not the main source of their revenue anymore, as people would think. They actually trade and have other products on the market as
Mhm.
well. And they have some domestic economy. So it's not nothing. I mean, it's not a superpower by any chance. The economy is not that big, but it's not like it's just an oil extracting, place ran by a dictator. I mean, this is what people miss about the place. And, I actually go there every year or so, so I actually know what I'm talking about it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's, they totally misunderstand the country. Is the first thing. The second one I want to get your view on is that at the BRICS summit, there was now the announcement of de-dollarization. Now, I don't have an in-depth knowledge of economics, but all the economists for years have been predicting the end of the dollar. And I think it was yesterday or the day before that the Iranians and the Russians can now use each other's bank accounts. So
Mhm.
they've sort of linked up the two. I mean, do you have any insights as to whether this has been talked about in the US?
Yeah, well, I've actually seen Trump kind of talk about this recently. It's just a very obvious result of putting all these countries under sanctions as you're kind of creating this alternative economic global system. And Trump, in an interview he did with Bloomberg, he it seemed like he realized that. He was saying, "Oh, I don't think I'm going to use sanctions as much," kind of hinting that he might lift sanctions even on Iran. But then at the same time, all these people that he's putting in power here. I mean, his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, he's another Republican congressman from Florida. He was just saying that to get Putin to the negotiating table, we have to enforce sanctions harder, and then they're going to go broke. He actually said because they're just a gas station with nukes, and it's like to say that over 2 years into this war when clearly the economic sanctions didn't work. He's saying
No.
they'll be bankrupt and that's it, and they'll be forced to negotiate. I mean, that's just not a realistic view. But so I think Trump and I think Vance seems smart. I haven't really heard him talk about this, but it seems like he would at least recognize, this what the U.S. has done. This kind of it's almost like a hubris, kind of trying to just sanction every country in to get them to do what the U.S. wants. And of course, Russia and China, their partnership. I know there's a lot of people worried about that, kind of in the Trump orbit. And Rand Paul, who's a Republican senator, he's kind of an outlier. He
Mm.
recently grilled Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, about this Russia-China relationship. Well, because Blinken was just saying, "Oh, how are you going to get China to stop trading so much with Russia?" And he's like, "Oh, we're going to start sanctioning these companies." And Rand Paul was basically like, "That's what you did. That's what led to this. Is all these sanctions." So I hope that there's some recognition in the new administration. But yeah,
I was in Russia a few months ago, March, February this year. And what struck me about it, and I went to east and western side, is how normal the place looked. It was very weird. You wouldn't have think this is a country at war. Now, in fairness, the government there also censors. They also keep things, under the loop. The population is not as naive as people think. One thing that struck me when I spoke to the people there is I asked them, what are your attitudes about the war? And I think the thing that really broke trust in the Russian government is when they announced conscription, because they didn't expect that, for example. So
mm,
there has been some, a lot of people questioning the war on that side as well. But the country goes on. It's something that people keep on missing about wars, is that, yes, there is a war being fought and things, but the economy goes.
mm,
And it's sort of, you had this weird feeling. I sort of, thought it was like the US during the Iraq war. Yes, the US was in Iraq, but within the US, people's lives still went on to some extent. So, it's just something to add to there. I can only get to the Gaza conflict because, I listened to your interview with Scott Warden the other day, but maybe just give us sort of like a background as to what is the humanitarian situation in Gaza like, because it's quite frightening.
yeah. I mean, again, it's gotten really bad just recently, even worse. There was all this talk for a few months about this general's plan that was drawn up by a retired Israeli general. And, if you look at the map of Gaza, south of Gaza City, which Gaza City is in the north, Israel has this corridor. It's called the Netzarim corridor. And basically, the IDF bulldozed everything there. They built some military outposts, and it separated this northern part from the south. So then they had this big plan to basically it's an ethnic cleansing plan, which they call it cleansing. It's not like, this is their language basically. There was at the time there's about 300,000 to 400,000 Palestinian civilians in northern Gaza. So the idea is tell them to evacuate to the south. Whoever doesn't leave after a certain amount of time is going to be treated as a combatant, and we're going to kill them either by military action or starvation, because they're going to impose a full siege. In the beginning of October, Israel ordered all, the Palestinians in northern Gaza to go south. Of course, there's no safe place. They've been bombing the safe zones this whole time. And what is down south? It's a bunch of overcrowded tent camps. Completely, it's just a horrible situation to be in. So a lot of people didn't go, obviously. And then what it looks like what they did was they basically cut this section of northern Gaza in half. So you have Gaza City in the south of this section, and then these other cities, Jabalia, Beit Lahia, and Beit Hanun, are the three cities where they focus this ethnic cleansing campaign, and they haven't let any aid into those areas, and they're destroying the place. There were some Haaretz reporters, some Israeli reporters that went in there to Beit Lahia, which is like the first city in the north near the Israeli border. And they said there's not a single house for anybody to go back to. There's only a few thousand people left there. At night, the Israeli military just fires artillery just blindly into the city to get the civilians to leave and to prevent any from coming back. So this is what's happening on the ground. And they're saying, the IDF has said that they're not going to let Palestinians return. And it looks like they're almost done cleansing the northern half of northern Gaza. And then I think it's obvious that the next step will be cleansing Gaza City. And it's not like airstrikes, they've still been bombing Gaza City, bombing all other parts of Gaza, at least dozens killed every day. So it's just really bad. And it seems like there's just such little attention on it now because of American politics. It just takes up so much space. And, I think what Netanyahu's probably thinking right now is they want to complete the cleansing of northern Gaza before Trump comes in. Because there are some reports that Trump said, hey, why don't you, wrap things up by the time I come in? But they also said that he would accept, some sort of what they called residual military activity in Gaza. And again, the people that they're appointing are so extremely pro-Israel, but I could see Netanyahu wanting to get done with the northern part before Trump comes in to say, he's got some victory here. And then you're going to have, there's all these settlers. They're actually camping out in Israel on the other side of the border, waiting to go right into northern Gaza and build settlements. And that's another thing. It's supported by all these.
Spoke in like February this year, and the term genocide, I think, just after the South African case, I still thought that, people were exaggerating things maybe, but, I'm still trying to say, okay, this is just a slaughter or crime or something. But I think now you can't avoid the term anymore. About what they're doing. I don't know if you saw the, I think it was in the UK Parliament, or it was some testimony some doctor gave where he said they use drones to basically snipe kids in the head. And I'm like, in what world is that seen as the right to defend yourself? Which is still the excuse that the Republicans use.
Yeah, and I interviewed Feroz Sidwa. He's a doctor, an American surgeon who went to Gaza. And while he was there just for a couple weeks in one of the hospitals in the South, he said he saw these gunshot wounds to children, to their heads and to their chests, like very young, like preteen children. And then when he got back, he started talking to other doctors, American healthcare workers who volunteered there. And they said the same thing, that they saw all these gunshot wounds to the head and chest. And of course, so many children are being killed in these airstrikes. But this is, a sniper looking through a scope and shooting a kid in the head. So he put together this open letter to President Biden, and he's been doing all these interviews. And the testimonies from these doctors, the things that they saw, should be enough to end. You would think in a sane world, it would be enough to end this, to stop U.S. support for this. But no, and I think it is, you talk about the term genocide. I was always a little, I thought it was important to cover kind of the ICJ stuff and the argument for it. I was a little hesitant to use that term for a while, just because it kind of makes the conversation about the term and the definition. But again, now at this point, I think there's no question that it's genocide, that's what they're trying to do. Because what they're doing in North Gaza right now is basically, all right, we want all of this people to leave. And if they don't leave, we're going to kill them. I mean, ethnic cleansing, that's genocide, basically. So, yeah, I don't think there's really an argument against it at this point. And
I saw you showed, I think you posted yesterday, it was on Haaretz saying maybe it's genocide. I
mhm.
retweeted that. But what would the conversation be in Israel like about this? I mean, the Israelis, surely the Israelis cannot be so ignorant as to what is going on. I mean, I suppose it applies equally so to America, to the faction that's still so pro-Israel. I mean, surely you can't, I mean, this information must be filtering at some level to even the people who are committing these crimes.
I mean, if you look at it, it really is no secret. I mean, again, that was from Haaretz, that article. Maybe it's genocide, and basically the whole article argues that, yeah, this fits the definition of genocide. What's happening in Gaza? So I think most Israelis support what's happening in Gaza, and I think a lot of them want the Palestinians gone. They just want them out of there. They don't want to deal with them anymore. I think that is the attitude of a lot of Israelis. Of course, there's peace activists. There's always been people against the occupation in Israel. And, we kind of rely on them for a lot of for a lot of these reports. Like Bet Salem, the human rights group, they were the first one to really call what's the occupation apartheid. They recently put out a thing saying, Israel's carrying out an ethnic cleansing campaign in northern Gaza. So there certainly are people against it in Israel, but there was always this radical segment of the Israeli society, these settlers, and all the violence over the past year. That's just probably radicalizing the Israelis more.
Well, as a South African, the term apartheid has been used a lot for Israel. But I'm sorry, but look, I'm Afrikaner as well. But what Israel is doing goes far beyond what the apartheid regime would ever have done. I mean, the apartheid regime, they had the doctrine of separate development. So yeah, they believed separatism. Yeah, there was racism. But through that warped ideology, they built schools and universities. Yes, it was inferior education because there was a lot of wrong in that system. But the apartheid army never went on a mass genocide skill and would never snipe children like this. The only time they killed children was 1976, and that brought down the government.
Mm-hmm.
When they had like an attack on it. So, and this is just like the hypocrisy to me is that, I mean, and it's especially true outside of the Western world, if you will. All these governments, South Africa, obviously, Israel's a very sensitive issue because of the comparable example to apartheid, but they look at this with one incredible level of hypocrisy to say, well, if anything, even remotely similar goes wrong in our countries, the entire Western world's cameras is on it. Maybe rightfully so. It's a dictatorship. It's this, is that. It often comes with U.S. military intervention. It comes with sanctions, like in Zimbabwe. But if Israel does it, oh guys, you just get more military money. You're allowed to commit more crimes, and then we're not allowed to call you hypocrites. When we do that, you blame us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, you look at what's been happening in the West Bank. I mean, over the past year, everything has just gotten worse there. These settlers just attacking and killing Palestinians while they're harvesting their olives, and the expansion of settlements, and all these raids that are happening. And they've been launching these big raids into these cities in the West Bank, and they bring bulldozers and they destroy the roads and the infrastructure before they leave. And it's clear because they want them out of there. They want to conquer that land. So yeah, it's just, there's no denying this. There's no denying it's amazing. You see this from Huckabee, as I mentioned, and I've seen other Republicans say this, that there's no occupation in the West Bank. And it's just completely absurd. Like, the Palestinians have, are treated as if they have no property rights at all. They can just be pushed out of there, and that's that. So yeah, I mean, that's what is worrying with this new Trump administration, because Biden, again, they kind of pretend they do this kind of dance, like they care about certain things, like they've sanctioned some settlers. They say that the settlements shouldn't expand, but at the same time, they continue to give them the military aid and the weapons to do this stuff. But with this Trump team that's going to come in, they're just going to be, I think, blatantly in support of the
I've always been asking the question, is it Israel wagging the US dog, or is it just the US wanting this anyways? And over the last year, I've increasingly been convinced that there's a certain elements within the US establishment that looks at this through, it must be some psychotic type of realism lens, because I don't see how we can morally justify that. We're saying, well, it's better that we have them there because we have a foothold in the Middle East, and if that means crimes against humanity, who cares? We're the
yeah.
superpower. I still believe that, is it? And with the Trump administration, that's increasingly clear with me that they'll spin whatever story they can because ultimately they like the setup.
Hmm.
They like the fact that Israel is there to dish out blows to the Arabs whenever they want to. I can't see any other rationale for it because if the US, with the amount of support that your government gives, Israel, tomorrow would just apply 1/10 of the sanctions that they applied to the South African government under apartheid, it'll be the end of the Israeli government. They'll reform that stuff, but they obviously don't want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the question is why. I mean, because people say, like you said, it gives the U.S. a foothold in the Middle East, but the U.S. is friends with all the Arab, the Gulf Arab monarchies, and Israel actually kind of gets in the way of that relationship, especially now. They have all their big bases in those countries. There's not really any U.S. military presence in Israel. It's very small. So I think within the government, there's uh, just the Israel lobby certainly is a big reason why. And it is, I mean, you see Joe Biden has said, how many times has he said, oh, I'm a Zionist. I've always been a Zionist. We're always going to support Israel. And then again, you see it much more clearly with this among the Republicans and with this Trump team, that it is ideological, that they believe God. Some of them, this was like Mike Pompeo, and they have this view that God gave this land to the
Yeah,
Israelis, to the
the
modern state.
religion plays a role there. I mean,
Yeah,
you saw this with these recent pogroms in Amsterdam. I mean, it wasn't pogroms they provoked, but I
yeah,
mean, I look at Spiked, and I used to write for them. I mean, this is the sad thing is that when outlets that I used to write for start chanting this stuff, I don't know what to say to those editors anymore because I know some of them. But like, the story wasn't even called yet, and it's automatically Israel's afraid to defend of themselves. Pogroms, Jews are being attacked. They're hated
mhm,
for who they are. I mean, it's got nothing to do with the fact that they shouted, F the Arabs, that they shouted, why is there no kids left, that they
mhm,
assaulted people, that they were deliberately provocative, that they were looking for a fight, that they actually started fights. No, that context is totally gone. It's all because, the Israelis are being attacked. This is Hitler coming back. I mean, it's so juvenile.
mhm.
And it has to be some level of ideological bias because I just don't understand it.
Yeah, and that even like it was something like 5 people were had to go to the hospital. Like, is that even a lot? Like for soccer, like hooligan fights, like
No,
it just doesn't seem like it. It would have been a big deal if it was some other visiting team and their fans got rowdy, and so it's just it is really strange the way that spread, and yet pogroms. I mean, it's completely absurd to call that a pogrom. I mean, yeah. So yeah, it makes you wonder, like, what is the reason for these things? And I think when it comes to the U.S. again, the kind of you do get the evangelical Christian side of it. They're very influential in American politics, and it is like a certain strain because I'm a Christian, and their beliefs aren't. There's no theological reason for me to support the modern state of Israel, but there is like a specific strain of evangelical Christianity that's originated in the U.S. Dispensationalism started in the 1800s, and those are the people who think the end. They need to do this to bring about the end times, as if God needs help doing that. And so that is a thing that is a big part of this. And you see this with these organizations. They have a lot of money and they're very influential. Same thing with the Israel lobby and APAC and everything. Um, I think it's changing. Young Americans like my age, millennials and younger, Gen Z, even whether you're on the left or the right, are much more skeptical of Israel. There was a poll recently that found young Republicans don't think, the U.S. should. I forget exactly what the question was, but it was the majority of young Republicans said something like, "Oh, the U.S. shouldn't give them all this military aid." So it is changing, but for now, for the near future, this is going to be, Israel is going to be able to get the U.S. to do whatever it wants.
And how long do you think that future will be? And I suppose that's the question to ask.
Yeah. And also, how long is, it's so hard to say with just all this violence over the past year, like how bad things could get in the Middle East and, where we're going to be at in a few years. I mean, they're just not stopping. Like, there's been this talk of ceasefire in Lebanon, but they just keep hammering them with airstrikes, killing dozens of people every day. Now there looks like Israel might be trying to move into more Syrian territory. They're like building along the separation barrier between the Israeli occupied Golan Heights and the rest of Syria. They've been doing these little ground raids, and now they're building roads along there. Like, it looks like they have some plans for Syria now. So, yeah, I mean,
Well,
things
I
could
mean,
be.
I looked at, I mean, you speak of Lebanon, this was the last point. I have colleagues from Lebanon, and I work with engineers and architects, and they're very passionate about buildings. And one guy showed us a hotel the other day. It was one of these old hotels with like Roman ruins behind it. You could still see the Roman columns, totally bombed. And you're like, wow, you just destroyed this cultural heritage monument in Lebanon. That's not even to mention you destroyed everything else. And you just see, how those people are affected by this.
Mm,
And again, there's almost no airtime given for the comparable, crimes that are being committed in Lebanon at the moment. And it's the same rhetoric again. Oh, yeah, as if Hezbollah is the entire Lebanon, as if
yeah.
there's no understanding as to why Hezbollah existed in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, they've been bombing Christian villages in the north and like just demolishing all the buildings, bombing the rescue workers, and then bombing them again when other rescue workers come to say it. Like, it's really barbaric, and it is this
And then
justification.
you have other idiots saying that this is all Hamas's fault. This is all Hezbollah's fault. I mean, seriously. I mean, as if Israel has no agency, as if they're not
Mhm.
committing the crimes.
Yeah, yeah, and especially in the U.S., people don't understand Hezbollah, like what they are actually. They just think there's some like militia, like terrorist group, but they have, they're basically a state within a state in southern Lebanon, and they run hospitals, and they have this whole civilian and political wing, and that's, I think the justification that Israel might give the U.S., if the U.S. even cares about them killing all these rescue workers, is like, oh, they're Hezbollah, they're linked to Hezbollah, so we can kill them too. Um,
Well,
you know,
I mean, when people don't understand about it, the reason these groups get traction is because, in contrast to the PLO, they're not corrupt. Okay, is you can, in a sense, trust them if you're in those countries, and they do provide some social services. They do provide other things for them. Yeah, okay, they have an armed militia. Nobody denies that. Yes, they carried out some attacks, although, I mean, I question a lot about what happened on October 7th as well, because
yeah,
it's clearly exaggerated by atrocity propaganda and Israel killing their own citizens. But, be that as it may, I mean, they have some form of legitimacy. And I mean, you can easily compare it to the IRA. I mean, the IRA for, was it 50, 60, 70 years, if I remember correctly, was killing British soldiers and civilians in the street. They did all of these terrorist acts. But at the end of the day, the British found that the way to defeat was just negotiate with them.
hmm,
If you bring them into political structure, they collapse within the first few months. Okay, this will be similar if you actually want to solve that problem. But again, I get the impression that the US and Israel does not want to solve the problem. They actually like the status quo.
yeah, and I mean, the U.S. got right behind Israel's invasion of Lebanon. They were saying, oh, that they wanted a ceasefire, but as soon as they really escalated things, then the U.S. was just totally in support of it, saying that they want to basically take Hezbollah out of the political of the parliament. I mean, is what the State Department is saying. Like, it's just totally crazy how they're
Didn't
completely
they try
supporting it.
that in Iraq with the Ba'ath Party? And it didn't work out very well.
Yeah, I think they did try that. Yeah.
All right. Anyways, I think this was getting close to the end of our time. I suppose just the last few minutes. I mean, first, thanks for this discussion. But people can find you on antiwar.com, and you've also gotten a little bit more famous these days. I see with people more followers. How's that going for you?
Oh yeah, yeah. So I don't know. Do you know who Dave Smith is?
Yeah,
Yeah, he's gotten really big.
Indian.
So he's a libertarian, and he's a big fan of antiwar.com, and he goes on Joe Rogan all the time, which is like the biggest show now at this point, probably in the world, maybe. And he mentioned me in the interview I did with the doctor who was in Gaza, and during the show, Joe Rogan pulled his phone out and said, "Oh, I'll follow him on Twitter," and so I got like 30,000 Twitter followers after that. It's crazy how big that show is. So it's cool to have that, um, you know, extra audience now on Twitter. So because I put out all my articles and videos and everything on there too. So it's nice to be able to spread that around.
Well, I mean, I said to you last time, so I think your website is still one of the most important on the internet, simply because it
Thank
covers
you.
one of the most consequential topics, which is, those of us outside of the Western world wants to know when we're going to be bombed next. It's usually good good to know which country to go on holiday to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate that.
Anyways, sure, man. Anyways, thanks a lot for joining me, and yeah, maybe we'll do this again some few months from now. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks for having me.